Good morning, Highlands Presbyterian, on this July 5th. We're going to be continuing in Romans. We're in Romans chapter 12, going to be reading verses 1 and 2. Hear now the word of the Lord. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercy of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and accountable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So Paul starts out and he says, I appeal to you, therefore. And the therefore is always, we always want to know that's when an argument is turning. And so we always want to ask kind of what is before, what is that resting on, so we know we have a good idea of where we are going. And in this case, the therefore is resting on the previous 11 chapters of Romans. Paul has spent all of this time building up, and the conclusion of Romans is really the practical application, but it all rests on the previous 11 chapters. He's been explaining for chapter and chapter and chapter about why this practical application is this way, but he wants to know why we believe what we do, what we believe, why we believe it, why it matters. And what's so great, I think, about Christianity is the first 11 chapters is all about grace and how God acts first and God reaches out in mercy. And so, as Christians, we need to have a thorough understanding of that before then we go figure out how it is we are to live, both as individuals and as a community. For once we've understood that it's God who reaches out to us in grace while we were enemies of God, while we were sinners, that changes the way we live, right? Because then we're not living out of obligation, but then we're living out of a place of gratitude. And if we are grateful for what God has done for us when we didn't deserve it, we are much more likely to be gracious to people in the world around us, because we then aren't in a position to judge them, because we have, in a sense, escaped from the judgment that we deserve. And so this should then set us up to go into the world as a gracious people. So 11 chapters, Paul is explaining why we should be grateful and gracious and in awe of who God is. And then he says, therefore. Now, this is how it's going to impact your day-to-day life. And he starts off with a warning about conforming to the world. And so we think, okay, well, what does it mean to conform to the world? And I was thinking about this in relation to my search to figure out where I was going to go to business school. And everyone, the biggest thing they highlight is the average salary of the graduate, as if that is the only thing that matters. That's what their marketing is all about. That's what they're focused on. And, okay, so you go and you graduate and you start working, and then, so you've hit success, right? Well, no. Because once you start working in an organization, then the bar has changed, right? Then there's all these people above you in the organization who are achieving what looks like success, so then you have to start working and reaching those levels. So you achieved graduation, but then you started something else and the bar was raised, and so now you're working towards a different goal. And as you work and you work up that, and you're working towards those goalposts, those will inevitably shift. And the goalposts keep moving, and what success looks like keeps changing, and so it always feels like it's 1 or 2 or 3 steps beyond your grasp. I was thinking about this. Not too long ago I started watching a show on Netflix. And it was really good, and so I got to that point where you're watching, 2 episodes and 3 episodes at a time, and I was really engrossed in it. And then one night I took a second and I started scrolling through all of the seasons that were on Netflix. And at that point, I don't remember what it was. There were like 15 or 20 seasons. And then I found out they were still making the show. And I started to do some mental math about what it would take me to catch up to where they were currently. And I realized I could spend a year of my life watching this show constantly, and I still wouldn't be there because they're still making more. I was always going to be behind, no matter how much time it seemed like I put into this. And so I gave up. And I said, I can't invest in this and just feel like I'm just always going to be chasing the storyline. And that's sort of, Paul is inviting us to stop conforming to the world. He's saying, stop measuring your level of success by the world's markers. Because those are always going to be moving. And you're always going to be chasing it. And you're always going to feel like you're not quite good enough. Like you're not quite there. So he says, do not be conformed to the world. He's inviting us to define ourselves on a different scale, on a different level. And he says that will change everything we do going forward. And he says there's two things in here that stand out to me. One is he says we're offering our bodies as a living sacrifice. And the other is to renewing our minds so that by testing we discern the will of God. And so when we start out, we think about offering our bodies as a living sacrifice. The time Paul is writing this, sacrifice, especially in the cultural mindset, you didn't have living sacrifices. Sacrifice was a permanent. The sacrifice was brought. It was a permanent option. The life was offered up. It was killed, and that was that. But Paul's saying you can be a living sacrifice, and that we come alive to sacrifice ourselves, but then God sends us out still alive to go out and do. That sacrifice is an ongoing act. Now, there's something inside of us, I think there's sin that resists that. Someone once said the problem with living sacrifices is they keep crawling off the altar. But it's great news, because the fact that we're living means this is a process, and every day is an opportunity to renew our commitment. And it's not something we can do half-heartedly, right? You can't halfway sacrifice. Sacrifice is a whole commitment. And so God invites us to live out this faith each and every day, and we embody it, right? In our bodies, right? A sacrifice is a physical operation, all right? So often when we're thinking about our bodies, we're just thinking about how we want to change them. We think about, we wish they were healthier, we wish they were thinner, we wish they were different in some way, taller, more resilient. We want to change so much about our bodies. And again, that's that message of culture, right? To conform to it means your body's never good enough. You're always working towards something. So when we think about offering our bodies as a sacrifice, we come as we are. And God sends us out to embody our faith. So I invite you to think about that. How do you embody your faith when you go out each and every day? When we think about, going somewhere and physically serving, that's a very obvious way of doing it. But how else do you embody your faith? How do you spend time with people who are in need? And there's all sorts of different ways to be in need. But how do you go invest your time with them? How do you go places where you might be uncomfortable, but where God might do something in that place and open your eyes to a new way to serve, a new way to proclaim the faith? How do you think about, meeting people who are different than you are, going and sitting down with them? And then how do you react to them? How do we embody our faith, right? We take our faith with us wherever we go. It's a part of us. And so when we think about offering ourselves as living sacrifices wherever we go, what we do is a proclamation of our faith each and every day. And so how do we make sure that where we're going and how we spend our time, how we invest in others, is a proclamation of our faith? And second, I want you to think about renewing your mind so that by testing you may discern the will of God, is how Paul puts it. Now, culture teaches us to think about ourselves, to always think of ourselves first. But to renew our minds is to train ourselves to be more like Christ. Christ was always thinking of others, right? Selflessness was what he was always doing. He was embodying. Even with those who were sick, those who were cast out, he would go, he would be with them, and he would reach out and touch them. He would be in contact, he would be in relationship with them, and he was thinking of the other. For the things he did, he was thinking of how he'd impacted the other. So if we're renewing our minds and testing to discern the will of God, the goal is that our every action, our every thought will be rooted in selflessness. And so what do these tests look like? How do we test to see if something is the will of God? And so when a choice is before you, I invite you to think about, how does it impact others? What's the opportunity to serve here? How can I be selfless in this choice? And so at the end of the day, when you look back over the day, we think, how is God inviting us to be selfless? And how did we either move towards that opportunity or draw back? Perhaps in fear, perhaps in selfishness? This is how we can test things to discern, are they the will of God? Is this a way that I can serve others? Is this the way I can demonstrate the love of Christ to the community? Right? God shows us this up on the cross when God dies for our sins. It's the epitome of selflessness. Jesus Christ accepted a punishment that was not his, so that we may inherit a glory that was not rightfully ours, but is given to us through his atoning death. He selflessly poured out himself. And so whenever we come to a place to discern if something is God's will, does it serve others? Does it encourage others? Does it proclaim the death and resurrection of Christ so that others may have hope and joy? Does it bring the community together more closely? This is how we test things. And so Paul says, do not be conformed to the world, but be transformed. And so it is my prayer that each of us may be transformed by the grace of God that is at work, proclaiming a message of hope and grace in each of us. Thanks be to God.